Welcome back. I'm Stephanie Ruhle. New this morning, 2 senators have just introduced, wait for it, bipartisan legislation to fight foreign interference in U.S. elections, setting out clear consequences for any nation attempting to undermine the democratic process in this country. Joining me now is one of those senators behind the bill, Democrat Chris Van Hollen of Maryland. Good morning, sir. You and Republican Senator Marco Rubio have joined forces to introduce the DETER Act. What is it? What kind of consequences are you proposing? Because at its face, it seems like a no-brainer. Who wouldn't want this?
Well, I hope that's the case, because this is aimed at preventing interference in our elections on a forward-looking basis. There's been obviously a lot of investigation into what happened in the last election, but Senator Rubio and I have teamed up to say we need to put in place a clear deterrent to interference going forward. And we do that with respect to any country, but especially with respect to Russia. Here's how it works. Within 60 days of the next election, the Director of National Intelligence has to report to Congress as to whether or not there's been interference by the Russians or others. And if the finding is yes, as it was in this last election, then very severe sanctions automatically go into place. Sanctions on Russian banks, sanctions on Russian oil industry. These are very hard-hitting sanctions. So Russia would have to think very long and hard before interfering in our future elections, because the penalties would be very severe.
All right. Well, you and Senator Rubio laid sort of this out in an op-ed in this morning's Washington Post. And I want to share a bit where you write, "There's no reason to think this meddling will be an isolated incident. In fact, we expect the threat will grow in future years. The United States must do everything possible to prevent these attacks in the future." Senator, be honest with me. This is a great piece that the two of you co-wrote. But when you and Marco Rubio are sitting there working on this together, do you not have conversations about how the president has handled all this? You might not have a direct dialogue with the president, but Marco Rubio certainly does.
Well, sure he does, and he's been very outspoken about Russian interference in our elections, both in the past election, but also the need to stop it. And that's why we teamed up to look forward to the next election, because I believe if Congress passes this legislation, it could very well deter Russian interference, because the penalties are automatic and very large. And
but
so if you're
Vladimir
Vladimir Putin thinking about this, you have to consider what the hit to your economy.
But do you not ask Senator Rubio, when the two of you are one-on-one, and this seems completely logical, don't you ask him, why isn't the president on board? Why hasn't the president done this? What's his answer?
Well, listen, I'm going to leave, Senator Rubio's conversations with Senator Trump, with President Trump on the side here. Frankly, I don't know the nature of those conversations. But you're absolutely right. I mean, President Trump has done nothing to punish Russia for its past actions. Congress, on a bipartisan basis, did pass legislation early on in this presidency. The president was very reluctant to sign it. He did. But then he has really not followed through. That is why this legislation is important, because it's on a forward-looking basis. We don't have to discuss what happened in the past election, although obviously that's the subject of ongoing investigations. But we should be able to all agree that we should deter Russia from interfering going forward. And that's why I've hoped that this legislation will be able to get bipartisan support. And if the White House opposes this, we know we have a big problem there, but we have an even bigger problem, because this is future-looking. This is going forward, just making it clear as a country that there are consequences that any country will pay if they interfere.
All right, let's talk DACA, because exactly 1 week ago, that we would see some sort of bipartisan deal on DACA. Fast forward, a lot of vulgar statements, a lot of backtracking, and a lot of explaining. President Trump is now blaming Democratic Senator Dick Durbin for blowing a possible deal.
Yeah. Well, Stephanie, I think we all remember when President Trump had that sort of show scene at the White House where he invited senators on a bipartisan basis to come up with a plan. And so that's exactly what Senator Durbin and Senator Graham and other Republicans and Democrats did. They came up with a bipartisan plan, which, by the way, addressed every single one of the categories of concern that President Trump had. And the president blew that up with his repulsive racist comments at the White House. And that tells me that the president is somehow determined to shut down the government, either by intent or through total incompetence here, because the senators did exactly what the president asked for, and the president blew it up. And, you know, many months ago, it was President Trump who tweeted about needing a, quote, good government shutdown. So this is a president who asks people to do one thing. They actually come up with a proposal, and then he blows it up. I think he's just looking for an excuse to do what he said he wanted to do months and months ago. I hope we can all come together and resolve this. There's also the Children's Health Insurance Program. There's also funding for community health centers. There's investing in the part of our budget that deals with our kids' education and the Social Security Administration and the defense budget. We need to get it done, and we need to get it done now, and the president should stop blowing this up. Let us have a vote. Let us have a vote in the bipartisan legislation that those senators worked out. Mitch McConnell should let that happen.
Strong language. Strong language is usually rooted in fact, not vulgarity. I want to ask you quickly about something else that's near and dear to me. A letter you sent Jerome Powell. He's the man President Trump has nominated to succeed Janet Yellen as Fed chair. If you're looking at these markets, remember, tip your hat to Janet Yellen for those interest rates. You have asked him for assurances regarding Deutsche Bank and President Trump. And let's remind our audience, I worked at Deutsche Bank for 8 years. Among many issues, Deutsche Bank is the one bank that did business with President Trump. We know Deutsche Bank had already been fined for business they did with Russia. They were the only bank that did business with Russia since the financial crisis. And the chairman of Deutsche Bank, Joseph Ackerman, our Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross, placed on the board of the Bank of Cyprus that is now entangled in money laundering issues tied to Paul Manafort. And we also know that the Bank of Cyprus sold their Russian business to a Russian oligarch tied to Putin. So what is it that you are asking Jerome Powell to do? Because we know just last week, President Trump waived fines that Deutsche Bank and other banks owe the government. And granted, President Obama also waived those fines or pushed them back. But Obama had no conflicts. The president certainly does. He owes Deutsche Bank millions of dollars.
That's exactly right, Stephanie. The president is knee-deep in conflicts with Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank, as you said, is being investigated by the United States government. Deutsche Bank has loaned Donald Trump and Jared Kushner tens of millions of dollars. And what I was asking Jerome Powell to do, who's up to be the Fed chair, is assurances that the Federal Reserve, as a regulator, will not allow the Trump administration to cut sweetheart deals with Deutsche Bank with respect to the ongoing investigations, and will make sure that the Trump family doesn't get some kind of sweetheart deals in return from Deutsche Bank. So this is very important because the Fed has oversight in this area, and as the person who is now nominated to be the chairman of the Federal Reserve, I'm looking for those assurances from Mr. Powell.
Well, I hope you get them. All right.